For centuries, the first point upstream where you could cross the River Forth was here at Stirling. The old medieval bridge was only a few feet away, but it was so narrow that only 2 men could cross it at a time. You couldn't control Scotland without controlling Stirling Bridge, and something that important needed to be protected.
Legend has it that everyone from the Romans to King Arthur built the first castle at Stirling. It's not hard to see why. It's high on a volcanic crag and surrounded on 3 sides by steep cliffs, and it commands the crossing of the river. In fact, the first man to fortify it was the Scottish king Alexander I in the 12th century. It soon became a favourite royal palace, and each generation for the next 600 years added new walls, turrets and buildings. Stirling was built to be unbreakable, and in the late 13th century, it was put to the test for the first time. In 1286, King Alexander III died without a male heir. The crown of Scotland fell into dispute. 14 men claimed the throne, so the Scots invited their neighbour, Edward I of England, to mediate. It was a bad move. Instead of trying to help, Edward invaded Scotland and tried to conquer it. The war he began lasted almost a century and claimed tens of thousands of lives. One of its most famous battles was fought directly below the castle, which was in English hands. It was the Battle of Stirling Bridge.
By 1296, Edward I had given up on mediation and switched into full conquest mode. He sent 6,000 men to this side of the river because waiting on the other side, on top of that hill, was a man called William Wallace, who history, or cinema, has remembered as Braveheart.
Wallace was an obscure, small-time nobleman, but he knew how to fight in Scotland and win. He relied on smart tactics and making the most of local terrain. Which was just as well, because on September the 11th, 1297, the whole future of Scotland depended on Wallace and a tiny force of loyal men defending Stirling Bridge.
The English were a well-organised army with hundreds of cavalry. The Scots were mainly infantry. But on the morning of the battle, there were 3 problems. First, the bridge was so narrow, the English could only cross 2 by 2. Secondly, the bridge came out on a narrow spit of land formed by a horseshoe in the river. And third, William Wallace attacked early. There were almost 6,000 English soldiers, but only some of them had crossed the bridge when Wallace attacked.
The English army was now split between the 2 ends of the bridge. The Scots swooped on the cavalry that had crossed and began to run them through with their spears. Then it got worse for the English.
The land they marched onto was soft and muddy and not suitable for heavily armoured horses and riders. The Scots captured the bridgehead and slaughtered the English who were trapped behind their lines. Those left on the English side bottled it and ran away. One of the English leaders, Hugh de Cressingham, was flayed. His skin was divided up as trophies, and William Wallace supposedly used some of it to make a belt for his sword.
For the English, this was a total disgrace. They lost over half their army to a ragtag force of peasants and part-timers. They abandoned the castle to Wallace. Edward I was humiliated, and he would take terrible revenge. He spent years hunting Wallace, eventually bringing him to London to be hanged, drawn and quartered. Meanwhile, the war dragged on. In 1303, Edward launched another military campaign right into the heart of Scotland. This time, the Scots occupied Stirling. The English king didn't just want to kick them out. He wanted to teach them a lesson they wouldn't forget.
Edward knew that taking this castle was far too important to leave to his minions, so he decided to come himself.
And he decided to bring with him the biggest and most feared weapon in the medieval world. At the start of the 14th century, Stirling Castle, the toughest fortress in Scotland, was about to face the meanest military machine in medieval history.
The siege began on the 21st of April, 1304. Inside the castle was William Oliphant and a handful of men. But outside was the entire might of Edward I's army.
The English had 17 siege engines, including one weapon bigger than anything that had ever been seen before. The castle was about to take a battering, but it wasn't just shock and awe tactics. This was also public entertainment.
It was a spectator event, so stands had been built for onlookers. The Queen's apartments had a specially large window cut into them so she could watch what was going on. And the siege engines had been given special nicknames: Lincoln, Le Vicaire, Seagrave, Kingston. But the biggest attraction of all was Warwolf.
Warwolf was the largest catapult, or trebuchet, that had ever been conceived. It was built outside the castle walls and took 50 carpenters at least 3 months to complete. In July 1304, Warwolf was ready. It really was a monster.
In the thick of war, this would be a terrifying thing to see.
I honestly cannot imagine what it must have felt like. You're under siege, your food's running short, and suddenly all these carts start arriving on the field, and then they start to assemble outside the front of the castle, these great siege engines.
Yeah.
And you know within 2 or 3 days that your castle is going to be pounded into oblivion by huge stone balls flying through the air. It must have been terrifying.
And what are we firing? I mean, what, stones, fire? What's coming out at the end of it?
So, cattle carcasses, diseased cattle carcasses, the remains of your enemy. You catch people that have come out of the castle on sorties, behead them, and fling their heads back over the wall. And very often, their heads would go back over the wall with notes attached. The other thing is Greek fire. No one really knows what it was. We've lost the recipe for it. Pine resin, naphtha, saltpeter. Essentially, it was something that would just continue to burn. So probably some kind of petroleum-based or tar-based substance that was sticky, that would float, that would stick to everything and just keep burning.
A bit like some medieval napalm.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. That's exactly what it is. And it would stick to everything, and it would just burn and burn and burn. You know, and once you get fire in a castle, it's a lethal combination.
When the garrison saw this beast being assembled, they did what any sane human being would do. They surrendered. But Edward was having none of it. He'd built his toy, he wanted to use it, and he ordered them to stay in the castle until he was ready to fire.
The guys are going to get out and get on the brakes. If you needed slowing down at any point,
Okay.
tell these guys here and they will just put a little bit of pressure on the brakes and it will slow down and
Okay.
you'll be fine. Just remember just to keep walking.
Keep walking.
lass. Just keep on walking and you'll be fine.
Super. Stylish.
Guys.
Lines, are you ready? Lines, are you ready?
Born ready!
Oh, God!
There you go.
Oh, this is a strange sensation.
Trebuchets use massive counterweights to rotate a throwing arm loaded with a projectile. The shooting process uses brute manpower to raise the counterweight. With a machine this size, that's a lot of manpower.
One down, done.
Oh, is it all the way down? No, it's halfway.
No, it's not.
All right.
I know how a hamster feels.
We're nearly there, yeah.
Ah, getting there.
Ready on the brake! Line is slow! Down home! Fence to roll!
Wow.
Prepare to load!
It's live. We did that.
Yeah.
When you drop the box, you flip the arm, and away goes your projectile.
Well, I shall take a certain personal satisfaction in seeing this one go.
Go! Fire! Fire again!
Good God.
A single shot from Warwolf completely destroyed the castle's gatehouse. Stirling was in English hands again, but the victory was short-lived. 3 years later, Edward was dead. His hapless son, Edward II, became King of England, and the Scots came roaring back. They retook nearly every castle. Only Roxburgh, Edinburgh, Berwick and Stirling remained. They did it thanks to one of the most famous kings in their entire history, Robert the Bruce. Bruce was a tough, shrewd soldier. In spring 1314, he sent his brother to put Stirling Castle under siege and flush the English out. In June, Edward II marched an army north to relieve the castle.
By June the 22nd, Edward was only 15 miles away at Falkirk, and it seemed like nothing was going to stop him from relieving Stirling Castle. Only one thing stood in his way: Bannockburn.
The Battle of Bannockburn was fought within sight of Stirling Castle on boggy ground near the River Forth. It was the most notorious clash in the War of Scottish Independence, and one of the most celebrated moments in the whole of Scottish history. On one side was a Scottish army of around 6,000 infantry and 500 cavalry under Robert the Bruce. On the other was 15,000 English infantry and over 2,000 mounted troops. The only possible outcome seemed to be a crushing victory for the invaders. To defend against the English cavalry, Bruce divided his troops into schiltrons. These were tightly packed groups, bristling with pikes and virtually impregnable to a heavy horse charge. The English fell into their trap. They charged the Chilterns, and their horsemen were impaled on Scottish spears. Unable to hold formation, they broke ranks and fled.
The English weren't just defeated, they were crushed, humiliated, their knights gored by the Scottish spears, and others trampled to death, quite literally in a river of blood. And amidst all this chaos and this carnage, the English king, Edward II, turned and fled. And when Robert the Bruce took possession of the castle, he did what he always did. He destroyed it, so it would be of no use to his enemies again.
Bruce has a statue outside Stirling today, but when he'd finished with the castle in 1314, its towers and defences had been torn down and its buildings burned. For more than 20 years, this mighty fortress was a useless shell. Scotland's great stone guardian would rise again, and from within its walls would come one of British history's most dangerous figures. Not a warrior, but a woman.